So, hello everybody. Welcome to this fifth panel at the Mediating Scale Conference, co-organised with Magdalena Krysztoforska. Welcome back to those who've already been here for a while. My name is Oliver Kenny, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel this afternoon. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. Please note that this session is being recorded. The two papers in the panel will be presented one after the other, and then at the end we will have a half an hour roundabout for a discussion. Please post your questions in the Q&A box and we'll try and put as many of them as we can to our speakers. Please try to formulate your questions concisely and please make sure to use that Q&A feature rather than the chat function. So I'll bring Patrick in here. So Patrick Brian Smith is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Warwick in the UK, working on a project entitled Mediated Forensics, Documentary's New Evidentiary Turn. He completed his PhD in Film and Moving Image Studies at Concordia University in 2020. His research interests include documentary theory and practice, spatial and political theory, forensic media, and human rights media activism. He has taught courses on visual culture, film and media histories, documentary theory, and activist media cultures. His work has been or will be published in journals such as JCMS, Discourse, Media, Culture and Society, Nexus, After Image, and Mediopolis. Today, he will be presenting a paper entitled Media and Forensics, Activism Across Investigatory Scales. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Oliver. I'll just share my screen. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Oliver and Magdalena for organising this. And yeah, it's been a really interesting couple of days. So my title for the paper has changed slightly to Forensics of Multiplicity from Forum to Fora, and in many ways sort of moves beyond some of the work that I've already been doing in this postdoctoral project to actually kind of push back against some of my own thinking, which has been an interesting endeavour. But so I'll jump right in. Over the past decade, we've witnessed a forensic turn across diverse fields of media practice. A range of artists, researchers, and media collectives have developed and deployed emergent media tools to transform the roles that the aesthetic and technological play in the mediation of evidence and its capacity to intervene in humanitarian and political struggle. Much of this work, which I've elsewhere termed mediated forensics, is broadly defined as, quote, a process of collectively assembling accounts of incidents from media flotsam, noticing unintentional evidence registered in visual, audio, or data files, or in the material composition of our environment. Such processes of investigation and assemblage are conducted through the utilisation of emergent tools and technologies across a diverse range of scales: geolocation, pattern analysis, remote sensing, photogrammetry, 3D modelling and scanning, cartographic regression, machine learning, computer vision, and synthetic data training, amongst a range of others. And these are used to help break down, filter, and redeploy varied forms of evidence. This work has been crucial in introducing new visual and aesthetic languages into investigative work and broader modes of human rights and political activism. These forms of practice have sought to operate counter-forensically, and I've written elsewhere about Alan Sekula's early formulation of the counter-forensic, which examined how forms of visual practice, and for Sekula as a photographer and theorist with primarily photography, aimed to, quote, take up forms of forensic evidence and forensic techniques typically state-created and state-produced, and turn them into an archive of accountability and resistance against the very same formations of power responsible for generating them. Implicit in such a logic of countering, then, for Sekula, is of course an acknowledgement of the longer material histories of state-sanctioned forensic practice and discourse, which are indissolubly wedded to racist, colonial, punitive, and surveillant forms of control and violence. Within the contemporary practice of mediated forensics, such forms of state and kind of corporate forensic mediation, from data mining to satellite surveillance, are co-opted and remediated to kind of create counter archives of accountability and resistance. To date, the counter-forensic has largely been embraced uncritically used as a kind of stable definitional category through which to read such emergent ecologies of media practice. Thus, of late, the forensic has become a malleable kind of conceptual framework through which to examine the interconnections between the technological, aesthetic, legal, and political in an era of data oversaturation, post-truth politics, and misinformation. In this paper, however, I want to point towards some of the limitations of such counter-forensic work. Such forms of subversion and co-optation potentially risk mirroring or reproducing the policing logics and models of state-sanctioned forensic investigation and surveillance that they wish to expose, critique, and resist. More precisely, these kind of countering practices often rely on the replication of similar hypervisible and transparent forms of mediation that have structured dominant forms and imaginaries of top-down state surveillance, monitoring, and control for decades. And a brief example, here we see several stills from a variety of forensic architecture projects that deal with instances of police violence. The techniques of 3D modeling recreate the perspective of events from both existing and non-existing police body cameras. As has been well established, various modes of heightened policing visibility, including body cams and dash cams, have often markedly decreased police accountability, structurally aiding the systemic expansion of the punitive and necropolitical state. This example is, I argue, emblematic of a broader tendency within these emergent forms of practice, where attempts to subvert and counter state-produced evidentiary forms are undertaken through the deployment of markedly similar visual dispositives and techniques. Our viewpoint is often reconnected to stabilized and supposedly transparent, though actually kind of structurally obfuscated forms of the surveillance. And this really isn't just to kind of trash the work of forensic architecture, which I do think is very valuable and important in a lot of ways, but it is just to kind of highlight or push back against, I think, these techniques of hypervisibility that often structure their work and needing to kind of unpack slightly more critically these kinds of modes of hypervisibility and the longer histories in connection to the forensic. Such a kind of mirroring then, or mimicry of these kind of state-produced forms of the forensic are arguably subsumed under what James Fries has termed a broader cultural economy of legibility. That, quote, cultural imperative for justice not only to be done, but to be seen to be done, positively begging for colonization by powerful explanatory systems, end quote. These emergent forms of practice perhaps risk reproducing the networks and infrastructures of power, control, and neat legibility that have undergirded the popular imaginary of the forensic for decades, operating as a set of kind of technologically determined, gate-kept tools and methodologies deployed by an exclusive set of expert actors. Here, I argue, we risk seeing a regressive move back towards a more conservative understanding of the forensic, structured around the techno-scientific legacy of forensic science and its base function in the service of state power. Moreover, these contemporary models of the forensic also risk overemphasizing neat and reductive binaries between truth and falsity, which have severely limited the political potentialities of any forensic practice. James Fries has elsewhere defined such a reductive binary as the interiority illusion. This kind of very much links in with the economy of legibility, which, quote, holds that truth lies behind a deceiving surface and only an expert can help us to excavate it. The interiority illusion is the simulation of a need for ownership that must never be entirely satisfied, end quote. Thus, the risk of these contemporary forms of practice becoming overly specialized and exclusive, while simultaneously stabilizing divisions between facticity and falsity, is that it shifts us back towards an understanding of forensics as an operative set of technologies in service of state power, control, and violence. In addition, it also risks foreclosing the possibilities for more communal, open access and multi-scalar forms of accountability and resistance to more forcefully emerge. Whilst these practices often attempt to undermine and counter forms of violence, the rhetoric of specialization, exclusivity, hypervisibility, and order that surrounds them potentially draws us back to the narrow apertures of state-sanctioned forensics that has dominated public imaginaries for decades. The aim of this paper then is to suggest that we must radically rethink the parameters of the forensic as it's embraced and deployed across increasingly diverse fields of practice. I want to emphasize the need to embrace a more kind of polyperspectival, experimental and multi-scalar definition of the term. And here I'm engaging with the scalar, I think, less as a kind of ocular-centric or visual epistemology, but rather as an issue of kind of questions of sightedness, cultural practice and relationality. At its most powerful, radical investigation is a non-hegemonic, non-hierarchical affair, and as a result, widening the scales across which we can read the forensic as a form of cultural and connective practice is crucial. Indeed, one of the most powerful and politically productive facets of the contemporary turn to the forensic is its foregrounding of the forum as a space of communal and collective gathering and debate. The word forensic itself comes from the Latin word forensis, pertaining to the forum. So as A.L. Wiseman has suggested, when the Roman orators used the term, they referred to more than just the legal sphere. The forum was a chaotic and multi-dimensional space, a domain in which both people and things participated or presented. However, when the emphasis is placed on logics of technological determinism, specialization and expertise, perhaps the productive multi-dimensionality of the forum is to a certain extent bypassed. Here, the scale of the investigatory remains delimited, narrowly aligned with those techno-scientific and oculocentric histories of the forensic. Indeed, as Pooja Rangan has recently suggested, the concept of the forum is perhaps the most under-theorized aspect of this contemporary turn to the forensic. And even though forensic architecture, I think, deal a lot with this concept of the forum, I think it's important to kind of look at the material networks within which their work circulates, and that the sense in which it's perhaps less of this kind of pluralistic space than they might imagine it to be. Thus, this paper aims to kind of try and resuscitate the multidimensionality of the forum that exists at the etymological base of the forensic. I want to suggest that we must push for a conceptualization of the forensic then as a communal and multitudinous set of spaces and sites that operate across different cultural scales and forms, rather than a limited set of emergent technical and technological dispositives. And perhaps in this regard, it's useful to read the kind of contemporary uptake of the forensic, or the contemporary use of the forensic as a conceptual framework, as what Susan Lee Starr and James Griesmer term a boundary object. Those objects or concepts which, quote, are both plastic enough to adapt to local needs and constraints of several parties employing them, yet robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. They may be abstract or concrete. They have different meanings in different social worlds, but their structure is common enough to more than one world to make them recognizable, a means of translation. So does reading the forensic as a particular kind of boundary concept or boundary object force us to expand the scale of the domains within which such forensic work can be conducted, re-examining which publics, communities, and aesthetic and political practices can be included in its scope? Is this where the radical potential of the forensic lies, in its kind of connective forum creating practice? And I think this is something that hasn't really been explored enough yet. So to offer two examples of what I'm terming a kind of forensics of multiplicity then, I'll briefly examine the emergence of a wide array of cultural and activist fora that evolved in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire in London on June 14th, 2017. We've just passed the 5th anniversary. The fire started from a faulty fridge freezer on the 4th floor, though spread rapidly to engulf the entire building, chiefly due to the recent addition of highly combustible external cladding. Tightly interrelated webs of state and corporate failure were central to the conditions that enabled the fire and led to its deadly spread. So here I want to argue that the kind of varied forms of community pedagogy, poetry, verbatim theatre and protest that developed in the months and years after the fire form an expanded forensic ecology, where the forum then as a kind of pluralistic and open source space is placed front and centre. By broadening the scope of practices and activities that can form such a forensic ecology, we can help to recognise the forensic as a particular border concept, comprised of a wider fora of practices that have responded to political violence across multiple scales and sites, not just within a circumscribed set of institutional frameworks or sites of practice. I think in this regard, it's interesting to think as well about the work of forensic architecture in relation to Grenfell Tower. They started a project that aimed to collect together as much kind of social media documentation cell phone video, etc., of the fire on the night. And that project just has stalled now for a couple of years after this. There was, beyond this kind of active collecting, that it didn't really progress in any kind of concrete sense beyond that. And in addition to that, I think pushing for an expanded version of the forum within the case of Grenfell is also particularly important due to the continuing failures of the government-sanctioned public inquiry. UK public inquiries, from the Macpherson inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence to the Hutton inquiry into the death of Dr. David Kelly, have received much sustained and enduring criticism. They've often been too slow, too costly, too elitist, too unrepresentative, too legalistic, and too constrained by politically drafted narrow terms of reference. They can be masterclasses in exclusion, operating by rules that from the outset privilege state actors. And the Grenfell inquiry has been subjected to many of these critiques, both in relation to the internal organisation of the inquiry itself, as well as the wider failures of the Conservative government to implement any of the limited recommendations made so far. When one or multiple forum fails, multiple others must come to the fore. So to kind of conclude, but also to offer kind of two examples of works that I argue form part of such an expanded forensic ecology, I'm going to focus on poetry and then theatre. So the first work is from Nigerian poet and novelist Ben Okri's poem Grenfell Tower, June 2017, which was published just 9 days after the Grenfell Tower fire. And I'll begin here with a brief excerpt. But in 24 stories, not a single sprinkler. In 24 stories, not a single alarm that worked. In 24 stories, not a single fire escape. Only a single stairwell designed in hell, waiting for an inferno. That's the story of our times. So sprinkler, fire alarm, fire escape, stairwell. Okri repeatedly uses these powerful forms of listing throughout the poem to interconnect the different scales of infrastructural, governmental and colonial and social power and failure that contributed to the fire and its aftermath. And within the whole poem, this becomes much more, this kind of connective idea becomes connective and listing form becomes even more apparent, and the scales at which this is kind of in operation. As Usta Healy suggests, channeling the work of Spivak, listing has both a powerful rhetorical and political function. Quote, in rhetorical terms, the list opens up a paratactic space. That is a space where one can place items side by side without a conjunction, opening up a horizon of possible connections, end quote. Within Okri's poem, the listing builds such a paratactical space, forging connections between diverse scales of power and neglect that led to and were complicit in the causes and consequences of the fire. Such paratactical listing serves to build material interconnections between areas seemingly unconnected as, for example, London housing regulation and forms of British colonialism. As Phil Scratton writes within Okri's poem, quote, power stands naked, stripped of the cloak of privilege. The forensic poetic form of listing in Okri's poem allows a radically different set of state and corporate connections to emerge. Such forms of investigative connection are simply not available within the narrowed forms of kind of forensic investigation delimited at the outset of this paper, which too often mimic the narrow apertures of state-sanctioned modes of visibility. To read Okri's practice here as part of a wider forensic ecology is not only to acknowledge the power of a poetics within the forensic, able to forge connections between diverse webs of necropolitical power in ways that are speculative. It's also simultaneously to emphasize the need for this kind of forensics of multiplicity, re-examining how diverse experimental fora can offer new hegemonic, counter-hegemonic forms of resistance that move beyond the conservative and technoscientific origins of the forensic, and it's privileging a particular oculocentric form of address. And for a final example, it's to theatre that I'll turn to for a kind of a example of a practice that I think also moves us back towards an interrogation of the efficacy of the public inquiry as a form. Grenfell Value Engineering, Scenes from the Inquiry, is a verbatim theatre piece directed by Nicholas Kent and edited by Richard Norton Taylor. And the images that I'll show you from here are from the television adaptation, which just played last week, in fact, on Channel 4 in the UK. precisely to coincide with the 5th anniversary of the fire. So the play is constructed exclusively from testimony spoken at the inquiry and deals predominantly with its second phase, modules 1 to 3, between January 2020 and July 2021. As Afira Akbar suggests, quote, the central focus, phase 2 of the inquiry, sees several corporate figures being interviewed, from the architect's Studio E to the main contractors for the refurb Ryden, along with Harley Curtin Wall, the cladding company that wrapped the tower in flammable panels. As Will Hammond and Dan Stewart suggest, quote, the term verbatim theatre refers to the origins of the text spoken in the play. In this sense, verbatim is not a form, it's a technique. It is a means rather than an end, end quote. Verbatim theatre is thus defined by its exclusive construction from text sourced from actual testimony and interviews. Kent and Norton Taylor have used the tenets of the verbatim form to represent edited and condensed adaptations of a wide array of UK public inquiries, including The Colour of Justice, examining the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, Justifying War, examining the Hutton inquiry, Bloody Sunday, examining the Sapwell inquiry, and Tactical Questioning, examining the Baho Musa inquiry. These works thus form part of their own subfield within the verbatim tradition, that of the tribunal play. Kent and Norton Taylor's tribunal works are marked by a particularly sober form of address. Indeed, as Akbar continues on to suggest, the tribunal play is a, quote, particular kind of political theatre which makes no attempts to be dramatic, reenacting the inquiry with an emphatic lack of theatricality. There is naturalistic lighting, no notable sound effects, and actors engage. Sorry, I've lost my place. Actors engage in a form of non-acting, uttering the words of council officials, manufacturing firms, and project managers with every last stammer. So, as Akbar indicates here, the tribunal play is perhaps more of an editorial rather than theatrical form, collapsing and montaging testimonial fragments from the huge archive of the inquiry to concertina and certainly kind of rescale the horrifying admittances of state and corporate failure that led to the fire and its deadly spread. Chris Megson has suggested that we can potentially read these kind of tribunal simulacra as, quote, acts of reclamation, an opening up of the institutional processes normally hidden from view. The achievement of the tribunal theatre is to offer audiences a synchronous replay, the cumulative effect of which is to indicate the rot at the top, end quote. If, as I mentioned earlier, public inquiries are often marked by a distinct sense of temporal failure, often lasting for years at a time and bridging large temporal scales within their own internal structure, the form of the tribunal play attempts to kind of editorially reclaim the power of diverse testimonial fragments to indict state and corporate failings, which may have been lost amidst the long durée of the inquiry. Extending from a similar theoretical lineage as the aforementioned concept of the boundary object, perhaps through these kind of editorial and reclamatory techniques, the tribunal play becomes a kind of what Serres and Latour term a folded object or folded concept, an object or circumstance that is, quote, polychronic, multitemporal, and reveals a time that is gathered together with multiple pleats. Within value engineering, it's through such kind of strategies of pleating and folding that the editorially condensed form of the play forces us to bear witness once again to the overwhelming scale of necropolitical failures of state and corporate power. In a certain sense, the tribunal play at once signals the inadequacy of the public inquiry as a site for justice, catharsis, or accountability, but at the same time reclaims it as a space within which there exists not only a cumulative effect, but also affect. It's arguable that this form of compiling dovetails with Nick Thurston's theory of document practices, where we can, quote, embrace the reproduced document's inadequacy as a representation of its original social life and resonances without giving up on the reproduction's potential to say something about that life and those resonances. Documentary reproduction expands the social life and resonances of the document. It makes them available to be read again, yet differently, again and again, without the regulatory benchmark of a correct interpretation. The editorial strategies of the tribunal play offer a powerful example of such a tension between the inadequacy and the potential of the evidentiary in ways that allow it to resonate again, yet differently. So just to conclude, as I think it's kind of apparent now, my interest in the forensic here is less with its deployment as a set of oculocentric kind of technological tools and dispositives, and rather with thinking more concretely about its etymological connection to the forum as a culturally situated space of radical investigative collaboration, connection, and experimentation. Through these two examples, I've aimed to explore what such an expanded ecology of the forensic might look like, one that moves us towards a set of experimental fora that can open up new scales of evidentiary investigation that work against the punitive, surveillant, and violent histories of the forensic. By broadening our understanding of the forensic, I argue we can resuscitate its radical potential then as a set of fora that can speak back to the techniques of state power in ways that resist mirroring of their own internal logics. It is, to borrow Toby Lee's terminology, perhaps a way of, quote, operating otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Patrick. Very, very interesting. If I could just ask you to take your screen down.
Sure.
Awesome. And we'll head over to Piotr and we'll come back for some questions in a little bit. Okay, so let's put okay. So Piotr Szpunar is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Albany, SUNY. His research centers on conflict, media, and memory, with a specific focus on political violence and mediated futures. He is the author of Homegrown: Identity and Difference in the American War on Terror, NYU Press from 2018. He's currently working on a monograph on lieux de futur, or futural sites, which connects the elemental turn in media studies and collective memory studies to examine the politics of building or altering physical spaces with the express purpose of bringing positive future visions into being and weathering anticipated dystopias. So unless he's changed his title, he's going to be presenting a talk called Spectroscopic Pasts and Tele-scoping Futures on the Red Planet. Over to you, Piotr.
Great, thanks. I'll just share my screen. Is that good?
Yeah, looks great.
All right, great. So I just want to echo everyone else and thank Oliver and Magdalena for setting up this really fascinating 3 days. A lot to kind of think about. And so I've tried to kind of adjust my talk a little bit to kind of connect to what we've been discussing the last few days. And so as a scholar of memory, I'll say a few things to start off about memory, scale, and materiality, which will hopefully kind of begin to forefront these connections that I've been seeing over the last few days. So for me, memory is a phenomenon of scale, right? We access it through individual recollection, through the firing off of neurons in the brain, through the collective affect and ritual, and in our physical environments. And so generally, scholars of memory focus on the various subdivisions of what over the last couple of days was called the mesoscale of the human, whether it's the local, the national, the transnational. And scholars of memory also focus on the short term, on the generational, especially in connection to notions of trauma, and even the longue durée, as in the recent work of Astrid Earle. And of course, all access to memory is mediated. In recent years, the study of collective memory has begun to take into account two phenomena that I think are anticipated in Bernard Stiegler's work, particularly in his insistence on the primacy of protension in retention, that is, of anticipation in the practice of memory, as well as his inclusion of Flint tools as the techniques of memory. And these two phenomena are the future and the natural environment. And these two things come together, for instance, in the cli-fi genre, which there have been studies on, that kind of highlight emergent practices of anticipatory memory, right? This idea that the Anthropocene has galvanized us to imagine how we might be remembered from the future. And all of this is preceded by post 9/11 security, right? And studies of that have shown how the future kind of looms over the present in security apparatuses. So I'm particularly interested in how the future comes to bear not simply on the present, but also on the past. And this is tied to another turn in recent years, the elemental turn in media studies, which has expanded our notion of mediation to include natural elements, right? Air, ice, water, dirt, and think of them as kind of structuring cultural and political practices, the idea of the elemental being infrastructural. So as Oliver just mentioned, this is an early shot at a book project, which I've been working on for probably too long at this point. And so, yeah, I'm interested in kind of these physical spaces, how they're shaped, constructed, and projected upon. And this is all against the backdrop of what Timothy Mort calls the end of the world, or what Benjamin Bratton has called the revenge of the real, as well as our resistance to it, right? If you think of any apocalyptic movie, the revenge of the real is often nothing more than kind of what one might call the tantrum of a petulant child, and then we regain control soon after, right? So it's against this backdrop where this is happening, but we're also resistant to the encroachment of the real upon the symbolic, the political, etc. And so, we do this to kind of bring about futures we want, and also whether those that we fear are going to happen regardless. And, the book has become really about the latter. And I've been part of a couple interdisciplinary psychology studies about future thinking. And what we found is across the board, folks tend to think that their personal future on a variety of timescales is pretty bright, but the one of their collective, particularly the nation, is pretty dystopian. So you have this kind of disconnect in thinking, I'm going to be doing pretty well while everything around me is literally falling apart, right? And so what I'm focused on in this kind of entanglement of these kind of visions of the future are on a couple of different sites. And the one I want to talk about today is Mars, right? And Mars is a kind of surface we've long projected our futures onto. And Mars and Earth are temporally entangled, right? Present day Mars is seen as a future Earth, as a warning that Earth could turn into that. Present day Earth is seen by some as hopefully a future Mars, right? And because they were formed together about 4 billion years ago, Mars contains the secrets of Earth's past. And as I'll hopefully show here, it's also a surface on which we rewrite our own very human pasts, right? So here I'm going to focus on the political dimension and its entanglement with the elemental, right? Our mediated access to the elemental and how that access comes to bear on practices of memory and futures, particularly in how we see kind of competing configurations of the human and more than human in these imagined futures. So I'll be the first to admit that any mention of Mars today brings to mind really the wacky designs and the very phallic rocket ships of billionaires, right? But there's a much more interesting scalar history here to be told. As a pale red dot in the night sky, the human eye divined this planet that had a retrograde motion to be a deity, right? The Egyptians called it Har Detcher, the red one. The Babylonians called it Nergal, the star of death. And of course, the Greeks and the Romans both designated it as the god of war, Ares and Mars, respectively. So Mars has played a role in the kind of eschatological and cyclical futures of antiquity. And these actually persist into present day discourses, right? On day one, Zach was talking about Elon Musk's kind of retro futures back to the 1950s, right? Perhaps Robert Zubrin, who's perhaps the OG of colonizing Mars, his is actually, he sees utopian potential in Mars because of its kind of proper distance from Earth. It takes up to 20 minutes for a signal to get to Mars, depending on the respective orbits, right? And this is very much not just an antiquated idea of utopia, but from antiquity. It's a very much a Thomas Moreian type of utopia. And so it still plays kind of a role today. But moving on, in the age of progress, when Mars observation was done through Earth-based telescopes with the aid of photography and spectroscopic analysis, the red planet became a site of intelligent life, right? At the turn of the century, Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli saw what he called canali on the face of Mars. And of course, viewing Mars at the time was prone to all sorts of distortions from the Earth's atmosphere and elsewhere. And later, American businessman and popularizer of Mars, Percival Lowell, chose to translate canali as canals rather than channels, right? And the latter are a natural occurring phenomenon, while the former suggests structures constructed by intelligent life. So a race of people, Lowell posited, were trying to survive on a dying planet, a hypothesis based on theories of racial environmental determinism, which were popular at the time. And the topic was the subject of much public speculation, controversy, and debate, but Mars was thought to be in an advanced state of development and decline, and as such became a harbinger for the future of Earth. And while the theory of a surviving race faded in about the 1930s, notions of life on Mars remained. Right? Its changing albedo was thought to be the result of vegetation, of lichen that ebbed and flowed with the seasons. And then in 1964 came Mariner 4. In a moment when the ideology of progress was in the midst of its half-century-long death pangs, Mariner 4's flyby images showed a dusty, dead planet akin to the moon, kind of dampening this idea that life could exist there. But in the grand scheme of things, Mars as a dead planet was relatively short-lived in the popular imagination. Once the advanced spectrometers of the 1969 Mariner 6 and 7 missions showed a planet to be more dynamic and also gave us this kind of whole Earth or overview of sorts of Mars, NASA worked really hard to communicate a planet that was alive, at least geologically. And this has remained a preoccupation. Lisa Masseri, who wrote a fantastic book about this, she did some participant observation at NASA in the early 2010s, and she crafted scripts for these tours of virtual maps for Mars. And they were edited by NASA folks to ensure that they would communicate a planet that was dynamic and alive, right? They were really concerned about that for a variety of reasons. So while spectroscopic observation of Mars began in 1867, it was really with these spacefaring instruments that the question of life was refocused on the geologic, the microscopic, and the non-visible segments of the electromagnetic spectrum. The Viking landers contested biology experiments in the 1970s, and the fall of the water doctrine of the 1990s, which persists in some respects to this day, highlight this kind of obsession of refining life, right? Every time it's dampened, we find a new way of trying to uncover it. So from a deity outside of time to a race out of time to an archive of deep time. In each successive stage, the scale is smaller and is pushed back further in time. And of course, in each stage, Mars portends Earth's future, however much, affected by the contemporary, anxieties of the time today, obviously being climate change. And the Perseverance rover today is searching for evidence of ancient life, or what Messier calls the archifossil, materials that are anterior to terrestrial life. So Robert Markley points out in his very thorough text on Mars science and science fiction that the notion of Mars as a frozen 4 billion-year-old archive emerged in the 1970s. Interestingly enough, this is the same time of a cultural memory boom in the West and elsewhere. And this remains the case for the NASA scientists which I've been interviewing for this project. Due to the lack of tectonic activity on Mars, unlike Earth, its topography has not been subject to change and recycling. As such, it could provide a window into Earth's own past and possibly its future. And this is no simple operation, so I want to offer 2 examples of how this is done. So on screen here are images from the mica files, the minerals identified through CRISM analysis. And there's a lot of acronyms in NASA, and I'll try to minimize them as much as possible. CRISM is the Compact Reconnaissance Imaging Spectrometer for Mars. It's one of the instruments on board the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter that was inserted into Martian orbit in 2006 and has been operational since. And the spectroscope in general measures how matter either absorbs or reflects electromagnetic energy. And this particular instrument focuses on the infrared or near infrared part of the spectrum. And examining the non-visible here is crucial, since some minerals reflect visible light in very similar ways, but absorb and reflect very differently on the infrared. Here, the data requires a resolution of an ontological and media surface, to use Zachary Horton's terminology, and this resolution must be made legible to human eyes. So this involves a really complex operation of calibration against lab observations that we see here, very creative cartographic processes, and also a creative use of color. The process is used to determine the mineral composition and can identify the kind of deep past of these landscapes. So here on the right-hand side, on the top is a picture from a companion instrument on the reconnaissance orbiter called the HiRISE camera. And it took a picture of this part of Mars, and we see gullies. And a reasonable hypothesis, this looks like Earth. Gullies are often caused by liquid water. But once you do a CRISM analysis, what it found is none of the minerals there showed any kind of alteration by ways of water, suggesting that other processes must have caused this. So what we see here, this access provided by these instruments, is also a window into the ancient past and gives us some really interesting information about it. And the second example I want to use is one that happens on Earth, right? There's a ton of analog sites that are testing grounds for future missions to Mars. And one of them is the Atacama Desert in Chile. The focus here is on the microscopic, and researchers look for biomarkers, right? Markers of life. In this specific study, it was fossilized lipids, right? One of the building blocks of life, which I've been told are not particularly information rich, but are robust and are a good kind of indicator of possible life. So these are preserved in a carbon dead form in the aridity of the desert. And this is referred to as zero preservation by Willem and her co-authors. And this whole process is really complicated, involves tool sterilization, heating to high levels, then cooling to really low levels, extraction, and then mass spectrometry, which basically destroys the sample by either heating it or some other process that helps to release certain isotopes or separate, as we can see in this chart here, certain materials that are indicative of biosignatures. And this is difficult because morphologically, it's very difficult to spot microfossils, even on Earth, let alone on an alien planet. So this scale is made accessible through the readings of these various instruments. So from these two examples, what I want to pull out of here is not so much that this is a prying open of the memory of the more than human, because I don't want to anthropomorphize the more than human. So we could look at this another way. Amit Pinchevsky highlights how the affordances of video, its particular time axis manipulation, and here he's working off the work of Frederick Kittler and Sybil Kramer, how this helps constitute a sense of deep memory that transcends generations. And he locates this really in the kind of rewind and freeze frame functions of video. So, and he does this in the context of Holocaust memory. But if we take the elemental as media, here an inscription surface not subject to tectonics and characterized by extreme hyperaridity, they contain their own context dependent affordances of time axis manipulation, right? This is perhaps intermediate that we have to kind of extract these through a whole assemblage of instruments. But what technologies like spectrometry give us access to is not memory, but deep time. But this does come to bear on human memory and visions of what is to come. And while these techniques are widely used, the visions that they are utilized to support are hardly unified. And I want to look at two of them specifically. So one vision or one position can be articulated in this 2020 white paper submitted to NASA's Decadal Survey, right? And this is kind of a survey from scientists and interested folks, which helps to determine the near future of space exploration. And this was just released in April of this year, and it's for the decade 2023 to 2032. So a group of scientists from NASA and elsewhere and academics outline a notion of ethical exploration in this paper under the rubric of anti-colonialism. And they forefront questions concerning not only the moral consideration for existing microbial life, but I think more interestingly and more speculatively, but also our obligations to potential future life and the preservation of non-habitable worlds. And if you search on the internet, there is circulating this charter of rights for the moon, right? To grant the moon some rights in, to kind of preempt the notion, the efforts to mine it in the near future. So this white paper was written by not just those who are familiar with the scientific work I kind of very poorly described earlier, but they're actually the ones who conduct this research and continue to do it. And what they're doing here is they're attempting to imagine the end of the world in Timothy Morton's sense, right? Not transferring the container metaphor of the world to our engagement with other celestial bodies. So here the trauma of the human past, of colonialism and its attendant ecological damage is brought to bear on the present through a potential, and this distinction is, I think, important, a potential rather than probable future, right? Because all this remains relatively speculative. Even the idea of non-habitable worlds, right? As our knowledge of extremophiles becomes more advanced, determining what is and what is not habitable becomes much more problematic. And of course, there's the kind of critique of this approach that it's a romanticization of these kind of pristine landscapes, right? And one example kind of used to critique this is, every year there's 100 million plus metric tons of dust that blows from the Saharan desert over the Atlantic, right? And the idea is over the eons, Mars and Earth have been cross-contaminating each other, perhaps not at that volume, but quite a bit, right? And of course, going back to the keynote previously, the dark forest theory might make these folks seem somewhat maybe naive in a sense, right? And because there are NASA scientists, astrobiologists who want to take the building blocks of life as a goo and just shoot it out into space and see what happens, right? But nevertheless, this is a form of speculative thought supported by the logic of connecting the human to the more than human, by uncovering traces of ancient life. And this isn't just about reclaiming indigenous approaches, right? This is very much steeped in science as well. So, maybe here there's an interesting kind of connection between science and a sort of indigenous mysticism. I know that's a theme that's been that I've not thought about, but that's been coming up over the last few days. And so I should note that for the scientists with whom I've spoken, whether they're signatories to this manifesto or not, the issue of human exploration brings up a whole variety of issues, right? For some, it's really difficult to resist the possibility of having human exploration because a human can do in a minute what it takes a rover to do all day, right? But for others, the risk of contamination is perhaps too great a threat. And two authors of this are working on a paper where they're using computer simulations to show just how quickly a human presence could contaminate an entire planet. And of course, this is the kind of second position, which is seemingly in contrast to this one, but it's perhaps a little more complicated. This paper caused an uproar. Robert Zubrin, founder of the Mars Society, wrote an op-ed where he accused wokists of trying to destroy space exploration, when he sees this already as hampered by planetary protection, which is a doctrine that came into its own in about the 1950s. And to the ethical charge of caring for uninhabited or uninhabitable environments, he retorts, rocks don't have rights. Michelangelo did not commit crimes in order to make statues. And for Zubrin and those who champion colonization, the potential indicators of ancient life that I've been describing in our scalar access to deep time, instead of leading to kind of an ethical prerogative, are read as ciphers of habitability, right? A very kind of much more human-centric idea, but one that is contested within the scientific community. So here what's happening is a sort of telescoping, right? For Bernard Stiegler, real-time media is telescoping, right? It occludes the work of time, right? For him, the present in this is instantly historical. Here I'd argue there's something happening in kind of the opposite direction, right? That deep time is resolved in the future tense in the first instance, right? But this also has repercussions for how we view our own human past. So Zubrin builds this promise of Mars atop Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, right? Humankind's spiritual renewal needs a frontier, and I don't have to read this quote here. Everywhere you look, writings on the wall, things are getting worse. Basically, it's make America great again, but kind of celestial version of it. So for Zubrin, this must be done by a vanguard. And history for him is the compiled accounts of great men, and he often invokes Christopher Columbus, and he attacks those who do not similarly revere great men. But I want to pause here for a second and say, I'm pausing these kind of two visions of the future, but they're not necessarily so separated, right? There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of folks in NASA who very explicitly side with Zubrin. There are those who do not. And there are those who are agnostic about the whole project. And, I want to caution that it makes little sense to talk about NASA as a singularity here, right? It has like 18,000 plus employees. But there are some really important connections, I think, right? While colonization is not in NASA's official purview and they tend not to talk in that language, NASA officials are mainstays at the annual Mars Society convention. And not only did NASA's living off the land approach to sustained future exploration come from Zubrin and company, but in documents, podcasts, and interviews, they share Zubrin's affinity for great explorers, right? Carl Sagan, who very explicitly advocated for not using the language of colonialism, still reverted back to that language, for example, when he called the Voyager mission the space-age Santa Maria. So Anna Singh writes that frontiers energize old fantasies. And pace Robert Markley's book, Zubrin is clearly trying to project an idealized past into the future. But I would argue there's something more complex at play here, because the Martian frontier offers something that the terrestrial frontier could never do, right? The problem of the native is moot. Obviously, the white paper pushes against this, but in terms of kind of life, human life, it is moot. So if Mars colonization is successful and provides the renewal Zubrin thinks it will, there's a subtext that this will also redeem colonialism writ large, revealing its underlying good, right? And we see this discourse everywhere, that humans are naturally explorers, that we're curious, right? And that may be so, but that discourse is also often used to kind of posit colonialism as an aberration or as collateral damage, right? Rather than take it head on. So there's a play of temporalities here, which is similar to one evident in security, where speculative facts launder the present actions of security forces, however unjust. Here, in this context, the speculative future of colonization launders not the present, but the past. whether this future comes to pass or not is irrelevant, right? Brian Masumi describes how the future is this affective looming. In his context, that affect is fear. In this context, it's hope, however misguided we may think that is. So the looming of this redemptive future holds in abeyance judgments of the past, whether definitively or simply deferring. And Mars seems to be this kind of surface, this kind of where problematic pasts go to get a new life, right? Musk wants to nuke Mars to make it habitable, as much as the science says that that's not actually possible. And others highlight that because we've done really well in warming our own planet, that terraforming Mars will be relatively simple for us, right? And this isn't just an American endeavor. There's a great piece by Rahel Ema about the UAE's program. They want to have a colony of 100,000 on Mars by 2117, and how that kind of launders the political inequalities there, right? So in essence, the kind of most problematic aspects of our collected past find new life on Mars. They're laundered, they become positives rather than negatives. And these ciphers of habitability play another function in visions of colonization. Again, I turn to Anna Singh, who reminds us that the frontier is an imaginative project capable of molding places and processes, right? Subjectivities and natural objects, namely resources. So in addition to Mars having this kind of proper distance from Earth, what gives it its utopian potential for Zubrin and company is its stuff, right? The medium material interactions that give us access to deep time are scaled back up to the human by uncovering or creating resources. And this is most evident in kind of the imagining of habitats. So, this kind of access to deep time and these instruments have allowed NASA to synthesize regolith, right, in a composition that is similar to what we might find on Mars. And this has been used in its centennial 3D printing challenge. And there's a whole kind of thing about 3D printing here, which I won't get into. On screen is the winning entry. It's called Marcia. It was by a company called Space AI, though I've been told that no artificial intelligence was actually used in its construction or design. But what I want to focus on here is an element that highlights what might be best described as the scalar collapse at the heart of this colonizing project, right? Dust. And I'll return to Marcia in just a second as well. So dust is often associated with death and decay, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And the dust of the World Trade Center continues to make people sick in New York, as does the discarded e-waste. Now, refuse from our global infrastructure. And on Mars, dust is a huge problem. It covers the entire planet. It's always in the thin air. It's a key part of the planet's climate, it has its own cycle that connects with the CO2 cycle. It's also ghostly, right? Dust devils are identifiable only by their tracks and their shadows. And we know the makeup of dust, again, largely through spectrometry, right? But it also threatens to kind of block optical media, right? And when there's a global dust storm, it blocks our entire view of the planet. And it'll get into everything if we go there, right? It killed the Opportunity rover, right? The rover's famous last words, "My battery is low and it's getting dark," right? Really kind of, there's a pathos there, there's a haunting there. And of course, the rover never said any of that. It was a kind of interpretation of the data that came back, right? But on Mars, dust is also a potential index of preservation, right? The zero preservation that I was mentioning early from the Atacama Desert. And the colonizing impulse attempts to invert its significance, and it does this in two ways. First, despite its ubiquity, dust is conspicuously missing from a lot of renderings of future Mars. And this absence could be read as a kind of cheap ideological move, right? Elon Musk trying to make Mars, quote unquote, feel possible, right? All the while, really, he's just trying to get military contracts to become even richer. But I asked a space architect who worked on the Marcia design that won the 3D Centennial Challenge, he's now with Blue Origin. I asked him why the designs were so clean. And his answer was pragmatic, but actually quite revealing. It was the affordances of the software used that make it actually quite difficult to render things dirty, right? It's easier to design things that are clean. And so here we have this really interesting notion of this back and forth between man and machine and generative design, which we imagine the future, not just through this thing we think, oh, we're the imaginative ones, right? This is really interesting relationship that's happening, right? What Yukoi would call tertiary pretension, right? But Yukoi thinks of this in a very micro level, right? One of the examples he uses is, oh, when you want to go out and eat, you search a restaurant and Google gives you suggestions, right? It's doing this kind of imagination for you, right? It's defining your next moment. But what's in, and this is part of this chapter that I'm still working on, but this is on a much longer term scale here. And the interaction is much more complicated. And I've been part of one of these camps where architects are working on this, and it's really fascinating, but I don't have time to talk about it today. I'm also not done thinking about it. So the second way Mars is kind of interpolated into these visions is that it can be tamed, right? Habitats that are covered by regolith are not new, but this one goes a little bit further. This is called particle regeneration. It was originally a project for the Architectural Association's 2018 visiting school in Amman, Jordan. And the design team created a habitat opposite of many others, right? It's fairly dirty rather than clean, and also goes up into the radiation exposure rather than underground. In fact, the design here, the tower climbs 1 kilometer above ground level. Then over time, inflatable habitats would be affixed to the structure. And winds can't knock this down, regardless of what Matt Damon may make us think, right? The structure would generate an electromagnetic field, which during a dust storm would attract Martian dust because it has its own electrostatic charge, right? And the dust cover would provide protection from the radiation. So this eventually was also entered into a competition called Marstopia, and it received honorable mention. And it's important to note that the design team and the judges were under no impression that this was feasible in any way, right? This is not something that could actually be built. But nevertheless, the honorable mention was given at the behest of a longtime NASA engineer with whom I've also spoken. And he said he did so because this is the kind of speculation of turning a problem into a resource, right? Using the scalar axis to tame the non-human that he says is essential for taking the colonization project further, right? So here, what I'm trying to show is this interesting confluence and connections between technologies, what we might call natural elements, and human, foresight and vision and anticipation in the ways that dust constrains, but also acts as a kind of infrastructure for kind of future imaginaries. And because this is a work in progress, I don't really have a profound conclusion. I don't even have a code. I have a Daus Segno, right, which is really quite, not fulfilling. But I want to end with this image because I think it's interesting. It reverses the evolution of man, right? We have a technological past that burgeons into a human future, though the human, of course, is still enwrapped in technology. This is produced by NASA. So here, I think this image highlights really interesting entanglements of past and future in nonlinear ways. It also highlights the human media technology and more than human assemblage as it plays out on the surface of Mars. So the more than human past, which we can only technologically access, is telescoped onto competing speculative futures along the spectrum that oscillates between collapsing and maintaining radical alterity. And I don't want to say that one side maintains it and one side collapses it. I think it's a little bit more complicated. I'm still working through those issues. But nonetheless, these futures reconcile the past, the human past, in starkly different ways. And I'll end on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Piotr. Very rich, really lots of stuff to think about. I'll just bring Patrick back in there. So there's all three of us. Very male panel in the end. So for everyone watching, if you could put your questions in there, I'm sure there's a lot going on there. Not a huge number of, unless you guys see them, not a huge number of connections I immediately kind of see. So I was thinking of asking a couple of questions to Patrick, and then perhaps coming over to Piotr rather than trying to cram you together unnecessarily. So Patrick, I was wondering whether you could start off by just saying perhaps a little bit more about what you called multi-scalar forms of accountability, and where you talked about parataxis. I was wondering, you mentioned like this multi-scalar and the parataxis sort of next to each other, and then also the forensics of multiplicity. And so you have these kind of at least three different terms that I saw, and I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about how you see those, because they seem quite important terms in there, but I didn't quite see like how individually they were sort of useful for taking it forward. Perhaps it's my ignorance, but if you could just say a bit more about that, would be great.
No, thanks. It's a great question. I think perhaps maybe just a brief framing of the kind of this project that I'm working on. It really started from the scale of looking at these kind of emergent practices, a whole set of them, which kind of combine open source investigation with kind of new media technologies, forensic architecture, Bellingcat, amongst others. And I think I started from a position of being like, this is very fascinating, and there is, you know, a lot of kind of rich work that is being done in that vein. But my sort of emphasis on these ideas of scale and multiplicity kind of extends from, I guess, a sense in which they are technologies that emanate from kind of, you know, various different forms of kind of, you know, different state apparatuses, and they're quite defined by these kind of narrow lenses through which we can kind of do investigatory work, and they precisely kind of mirror in certain ways those kinds of networks. So through these ideas of kind of the paratactic, the multi-scalar, is to try and think about, I guess, different kind of scales of investigation that operate beyond these kind of networks, but still keeping the idea of the forensic with its connection to the forum, you know, at that kind of base root of the forensic, this kind of, you know, what Wiseman terms of chaotic space, I think is really valuable to kind of think about forensics like outside of these kind of scales of vision, and thinking about the forensic as much more of an experimental and connective practices in a certain way. So I think through these terms of kind of multi-scalar, the paratactic as well, and, you know, I'm trying to kind of emphasize that, you know, a wider forensic ecology is valuable precisely because it can allow different forms of connection and different kind of politics to emerge, I think, as well, you know, precisely in the way that it, even in, you know, things that might never traditionally be think of as kind of, you know, investigatory practices like theatre or like poetry, have really valuable places. So it's kind of trying to resituate those, I guess, and still finding value in the forum of the forensics for that work. But yeah, so these terms are kind of loosely trying to connect those elements together.
And on that basis, like, do you see something specifically, or I suppose, what is the specific difference you see between the verbatim theatre, for instance, and the original testimony? Is there something there about paratactic, this multi-scalar or a scalar difference? Yeah, I suppose that. Yeah, what's going on there?
I think the interesting thing, so with the history of these kind of tribunal plays, the verbatim theatre pieces were made. The ones before Grenfell were made precisely because in the UK none of these were televised. Now Grenfell, everything is streamed online, so I think Grenfell does raise a particular question. So in the history of these verbatim theatre plays, it was really a site of access, and most of these were adapted for television as well. In Grenfell, you know, all of this material is streamed online, but I think, yeah, the kind of the value of the verbatim work in regards to Grenfell is this kind of editorial process, this kind of stitching together of diverse fragments because of this temporal failure of the tribunals in a certain sense, because they go on for years. So I think this ability to at once kind of within this kind of, you know, very simple technique of literally just editing together fragments of the inquiry is to at once signal the failure of the inquiry itself, while still resuscitating some of those, you know, the core elements of kind of, you know, powerful corporate and state failure. The play is kind of, it's a really overwhelming kind of, it's like a barrage of information, but it's really, you know, it's really powerful in that sense because it's condensing this kind of model of the inquiry. So I think, yeah, I guess this kind of idea of the of verbatim theatre as being at once kind of something that can critique the evidentiary whilst also finding value in those kind of fragments as well, is something that's really interesting. And as I said, I don't think this is something that's available within these kind of the forensics as it's understood within media practice at the moment, which is this kind of very narrow set of technological kind of, technologically determined kind of techniques, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I think this is kind of the value that I'm finding in it.
I see. Yeah, so it's interesting that you make also the national difference, because it makes me think of sort of the difference between like the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trials from the UK to the US, where in the UK, like you say, behind closed doors, it's effectively sort of reduced in a kind of, in a sense, in a scale as to a kind of piece of paper. The judge gave out his response, and that was kind of it. Whereas in the US, you had this kind of crazy media circus that meant that it was fundamentally different. Not to get into that in too many ways, but you had these just completely opposing ways of framing it, which comes down to national rather than necessarily anything inherent to that. Yeah.
And so much a question of scale as well. Yeah, again, this reduction down to the single document.
And just to stay with Patrick for a moment, Lawrence Kent has a question. It's quite a British context, so I'll give a little bit of context. But he says, and you can look it up if you click on the Q&A, Patrick. So he says, what would you say on the colloquial use of forensic in political discourse? So such as Keir Starmer is often talked about as having a forensic approach. To those non-British people, Keir Starmer is the current leader of the Labour Party, the opposition party in the UK, and he's often considered to be a forensic approach. He was a former barrister before he became a politician. So how does this bring with it the baggage of the carceral, the state, and certain notions of accountability?
It's a great question, and it's something I've really only recently started to think about, but I have started to think about it precisely in this connection actually with Keir Starmer. And it's amazing the kind of his emergence really came with this sense of, there's a slew of sort of newspaper articles referring to his kind of his work as being forensic, or as his opposition being forensic. And if you think about Keir Starmer himself he is so embedded with his history as the head of public prosecutions. So he has a history of I guess that's the baggage part of the question answered, in terms of he has this history within these institutional spaces. And I do think this question of the forensic is really interesting, because also the forensic, in a certain sense, when we think about it, is a term, and I talked about it a bit as a boundary object, but it's a term that means something and nothing, and in a lot of ways, and maybe I'm just bringing out my own dislike of Keir Starmer here, but Keir Starmer sort of means sort of nothing as well. In a certain sense, his politics are quite vacuous, and he kind of deploys, he might be very good at kind of, forensically examining a situation, but you never really get a sense of what his own view is on anything at all. So I think that there is something really interesting, though, about this kind of the intersection of the forensic within particularly UK politics at the moment, where you have Boris Johnson in opposition, and the sort of escape of his sort of post-truthism, Trumpian kind of post-truthism. It just manages to avoid, I think, any of Keir Starmer's forensic examination. So I think there's in terms of the forensics colloquial use, and it's kind of, outside of, literally as a term of kind of, explanation for certain political discourse, is really a fascinating topic, particularly in relation to Keir Starmer. So Lawrence, it's a really great question, and something I need to think more about. I'm kind of working in this mode at the moment of thinking about it through these kind of technological modes of kind of media address, but to think about it as in its kind of colloquial uses as well, and then within political discourse is fascinating. And so I guess I'll cop out and say I need to think more about it, but I definitely have started to. So thank you.
And just a final question. This is from Magdalena Krysztoforska, who just wanted to my co-organizer, who just wanted to perhaps push back a little bit on your analysis, saying that she thinks that there is something really interesting to say about forensic architecture and its downfalls, but she's not sure whether it's exactly in the way you suggest. So she wonders. So you say that there's this reliance on the techniques of surveillance, but there's perhaps another interesting symptom of their shortcomings, which is that they were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2018, specifically for their exhibition of the project at the ICA. And so maybe there's something here about their addressing the aesthetic rather than the activist and the political, and perhaps this responds more to a dwindling capacity for the art world to create political opposition rather than actually being able to bring about justice. Just whether you have any thoughts on that?
No, definitely. It's a thanks for the question, Magdalena. It's really a great it's a great point, and I think it's this battle between the kind of the realm within which forensic architecture sit is a kind of ongoing an ongoing debate in terms of, they're not quite artists, they're not quite intervening in legal spheres in the ways that they might perhaps wish. There's, if we look at the tangible outcomes of kind of forensic architecture's engagement within the legal sphere, it's very minimal. So I think that these questions are very interesting, though, because they're trying to, and this is, I think, what I'm saying with the value of forensic architecture is they are trying to resuscitate an idea of the aesthetic that is actually beyond a kind of, our ideas of kind of beauty or contemplation, and it's that the aesthetic as a sensing technology, basically, which comes through in their work. But again, they walk this kind of slippery slope, I think, between the art world and various legal spheres. And that's not to, it's not to, again, to just deride their work, but I think that these issues around the kind of the uptake of forensics as a term, and this goes back to the previous question from Lawrence as well, is the ways in which these terms are being deployed across multiple sites now is something that's really interesting, and is something that is, needs to be further investigated. So yeah, I guess that's a very kind of woolly answer, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So to go to Piotr, there's so many scales we get in your talk. We're going from particularly from the dust to Mars, and everything in between. And we've got all these diagrams of the spectrographic analyses. And you mentioned Horton, who actually is in the audience at the moment, his idea of scalar or scale collapse. And I was wondering how, for you, what's the relation between this idea of telescoping and scalar collapse? Because there seem to be some really productive kind of bringing togethers of these scales, like the discovering of so much of what's going on so far away by looking at the very small. And so I was wondering, how do you see those two as connecting or not, or yeah?
That's a really great question. I think how I, off the fly, I guess how I would connect them. And this is something, I've kind of interjected into the talk as we were going through the last couple of days. I think Stiegler's kind of initial ideas that, telescoping has, for him, it's very detrimental, right? I think at least in his initial kind of musings about what he calls telescoping is relatively negative because, it gets rid of difference, right? It gets rid of that kind of deferral time that is needed to kind of process things and think about things a little more thoroughly. But so I think telescoping for him, there's definitely there's a temporal collapse, right? Basically, like he says, the work of time is occluded. But I think what you're getting at is something a little bit different. And I think in what I was presenting, I think there really is this kind of parallel collapse, right? And I'm still wondering whether to kind of think of it as a collapse, right? Because I think, I'm trying to push back against kind of Stiegler's more kind of negative reading of telescoping and seeing telescoping as kind of something we do all the time, whether kind of maybe we do it in different ways now because of the nature of algorithmic media as opposed to kind of mechanical technology. So I would say, in the instance of Mars, right, this idea of reading the deep past in the future tense, right, how I kind of put it, there's absolutely not only a temporal collapse there, but there is almost not a collapse, right? It's almost a scaling up, right? What happens is you're reading these minute things, right? And what's happening in this project of telescoping is you're imagining all those things worked up into something that is more knowable for us, right? This idea of habitats. Okay, we can't just go there because we'll die very quickly, right? We need these habitats. So maybe there's a kind of scalar telescoping itself, right? In the sense that from this minute, on this kind of temporal scale that we're working, this temporal trajectory from present to future, and all the weird ways that it kind of falls in on itself. There's also kind of reading from those kind of minute things that we get access to in technology to thinking about these kind of very human-like futures on Mars. I know we talked, that was kind of a point of discussion that, as much as Musk wants to kind of escape from a particular scale, he can't, right? And on Mars, we're just kind of transferring that because, well, we need it to live, right? For at this point, that's kind of, we're stuck there. So I think there's this it's a great question. And so I think there's a reduction of alterity there. There is a collapse, but there's also at the same time this kind of scaling up that, I'll leave it at that because I'm not sure. I don't want to keep rambling on about it, but I think there's an interesting kind of collusion of collapse and expansion that's happening perhaps at the same time.
I see. Yeah. And your answer to my next question might be quite similar. So I apologize if that's that's the case. But one of the other things that I thought was really interesting was the way the different scales, or particularly spatial and temporal scales, came together a lot in your talk. Particularly about the idea of sort of deep time and sort of looking at the small to find the very historical. And it was interesting that this seemed to be quite different from, for instance, when we look at Zachary Horton's idea, or the cosmic zoom, and the way Horton talks about the deceleration we need to have as we go into something very small, or into Callie's talking about his scalar simulation. We have, when we go down very small, inevitably we have to slow down a lot. And so there seems to be, in that kind of way of thinking of scale, there's a certain kind of, and apologies if this is not exactly how you see it, but a kind of correlation between the sort of temporal and the spatial scale. Whereas in the way you're reading it, and particularly if we look at deep time with like fossils and fossil fuels and the all of that, the time and spatial scales are not being read in that same way at all. So I suppose if I can formulate that as a question, is like, how do you see the temporal and the spatial scales as coming together in your analysis of Mars, and how we look at it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, I think in my kind of coming from memory studies, my initial kind of interest was noticing that these kind of ideas of the future are rewriting the past, right? And while at the same time, this kind of Humean kind of idea that, whatever we imagine is just kind of taken from bits that we already know, right? So this idea that the past defines the future, but there's this kind of reverse trajectory happening. So I think when we look at the kind of corresponding temporal scales or speeds, if we want to call it that, and I think there's probably an interesting kind of distinction between thinking about time scale and speed, right? And I think what happens is that there's all sorts of really kind of non-linear ways in which this is working, right? And I think that just because, what I'm reading into kind of the way that the microscopic past, right, gives us access into this kind of like deep time, right? There isn't necessarily some kind of inherent speed or temporal correlation with that, right? I think I would kind of hesitate to kind of say there's some kind of inherent relationship there. I think in this, and I'm still working through this, and this is why I like this question, thinking about the speeds of technology and the weird things that they do, right? Stiegler has this idea of telescoping, but Wendy Chun's work on digital media is really kind of, I think, informative about this, right? How the future is a memory, and everything new is old, but everything old can be new again, right? It's not a linear process, right? And also how quickly these things could happen, right? Sometimes that tweet from 10 years ago could come up all of a sudden and become new, right? Or it could be, a new tweet, no one pays it any attention, it becomes relatively old, perhaps relatively quickly, right? So I think, I'm trying not to collapse myself, the kind of technological and the elemental, and thinking of they're very tied intimately, but I don't want to kind of think one through the other too restrictively. And so, and the idea of time, I think for me, thinking about time and speed here is kind of the essence, right? In the sense that with the folks that I've talked to at NASA who are in the Zubrin camp wholeheartedly, right? There are two things that are happening. Watching the Perseverance rover launch and the landing live, what you got from the scientists who were there was a very comfortable position of being intergenerational, that they knew they weren't going to be alive to see the results of their labor. And they were totally fine with that. At least that, in the light of day, they seem so. These other folks, when I asked them, why are you so behind this? What's your impetus? Like, I want to see it before I die. And so they're, the kind of, and it's hard to escape these kind of human temporalities that we have in relation to all these things, right? We want to see these futures happen quickly. Others are comfortable with these futures happening over generations and knowing they'll never get to see them, right? So, and maybe that is also tied to a kind of mysticism or feeling at home in a non or more than human cosmos, right? And that's something that, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah. I think that kind of links quite nicely to the next question I have, which is about your kind of framing of utopia, because I think like utopia seems to come up both explicitly but also implicitly very much in what you're saying here of where is that utopia by the end of my life, by the end of my grandchildren's life, or 100 generations. And I was thinking through to Lawrence Kent's talk this morning or earlier, for those of you who aren't in the same time zone, about wandering Earth and this idea of sort of taking the Earth away to an alternative solar system. And so I was wondering, like, is there something to be said about scale and utopias and this, where you talk about more, and so we kind of got this idea of like the far as a utopia. I don't know, I haven't quite got the thought in my head, but I wondered whether there's something kind of important going on in your thinking between these two ideas.
Yeah, I think if there is a connection between the papers, it's on architecture here in some sense, right? Because so my kind of, claiming that Moore's isn't just kind of Zubrin's isn't just a retro future, it's a kind of antiquated utopia, right? I mean, Thomas More's utopia, they dig, a moat around utopia. They have to kind of keep their space, right? The New World was seen as a utopia, particularly because of its space from the old world, right? And Zubrin is, maybe not explicitly talking about this, but it definitely feels very front and center in his thinking. The kind of the historians of time and the kind of historians of history, they try to kind of create these like regimes like antiquity, modernity, and now presentism or whatever, right? And this kind of idea that there's a return to the spatial. And what I think is, what I would say about the kind of present utopia, there is a spatial aspect to it, or at least it's really easy to get at through the spatial, and that's through these habitats, right? These habitats are kind of architectural articulations of utopia, right? Not only in how they're presented and built, but also in how they're designed. And I didn't get much time to talk about generative design, but there's this very kind of interesting kind of technological human creativity that's happening that is speaking towards a future in which a lot of what we do is done with technology, but to our benefit, right? So there's this kind of utopia that kind of manifests not only in the final product of the architecture, but in the process of designing the stuff. Because a lot of these folks, yes, there are retro futures and Musk does that, but a lot of these architectural folks explicitly want to avoid domes. They want to avoid anything that, hints at that old utopia. They want to use this generative design, which is really kind of, it's really just trial and error, and working out kinks in the software and not really understanding how it works. The software that they use is designed for animation and for jewelry design. It's not designed for architecture, but it's been kind of poached by them to kind of experiment, right? Which is also really interesting, right? So this utopia, it's spatial. The way I look at it is in a kind of spatial way that is recognizable through the architecture and the process by which we kind of create these speculative, habitats.
I see. Yeah. Sorry, my connection
cut out for a moment there, but I really like this idea of like architecture and jewelry, and somehow like I don't know whether, Patrick, you wanted to kind of respond to that at all in this bringing together of architecture, or perhaps not.
No, I think the question of kind of utopia or the utopian potentials or the utopian ideas is something that I think also kind of comes through in this idea of the fora of the forensics, that I think is perhaps also quite problematic now that I kind of start to think about the kind of, it's idealistic in a lot of ways. So I think there's that just the notion of the utopia made me think about that. But yeah.
Okay, so unless there are any other questions, I think I'm going to call it a day there, unless there's anything else either of you would like to sort of add to your wonderful thoughts. I mean, it's been so great, and there's so much to kind of think about here, and yeah, so much to kind of take away. So if there's nothing else, on behalf of myself and Magdalena Krysztoforska, I'd like to thank you once again for presenting your work here and for giving us all this inspiration. Thank you to the audience for their questions. We have our final keynote from Thomas Moynihan, which will be coming up in about an hour. So please join us for that. He's going to be talking about long-termism and kind of intellectual history of how we think about extinction. So please join us for that. If not, I'll say goodbye and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for hosting. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Bye.